That's that.
All right. All right. Well, good. All right. So thank you everybody for attending. Really happy to have everybody here and see some very familiar faces. So that's good. This is a little talk, and I've left plenty of time for Q&A, even with the delay. So we can have some discussion. With AI and development, we're all still learning, including myself. I've dove pretty heavily into this over the last couple years, and yeah, it's been really interesting to watch and keep tabs on, and having some clients that I deal with that uh, are building AI and using Gen AI and trying to figure it all out. You kind of see some of the things that are happening out there, and some of the good things, some of the confusing things, and like I said, kind of we always joke around about it, but it seems to change every day. So it's like you think you are on top of this, and then every day the tool sets change, the models are different, and then it's all relearning again. So and that's kind of the way that we have to approach software development as well. So that's what this is all about, is just trying to look at what are some of the considerations you have to really think about, how AI development is very different from software development. Most of us are from software development environments and we tend to know how to do things. And then, just look at AI as just some other technology and we should probably do it the same, but then it's very different. So that's what we're going to kind of tackle. And as with most of these things, I've done a number of presentations in this sort of area. The expectation is that if it raises more questions than answers, then we probably did our job, right? We achieved something here. So, if anybody has any questions as we're going through this, or there's a discussion point that you'd like to jump in, please feel free to do that. You don't have to wait for me. And like I said, we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers. And I'd also like to credit JD Gabicki on here, who I've known for many, many years. And he probably doesn't remember this, but when I started my organization, Agile Infusion, 20 some years ago, he actually created the logo for me. So
Thank you, Bob.
thanks, JD.
Oh yeah.
Actually, he just changed it and put a little brainy thing on there and then
Yeah, it wasn't
accentuated AI.
right.
So that was my big thing. And I think I had to go to Fiverr to get somebody to do that. So still don't have those skills, but thank you.
Sure.
It lasted 20 years. That's pretty good. All right. So thanks for hanging in there. Okay, so this is just a little background on myself, real short. 40 some years in software and systems development, many different levels. I was one of the early Agile adopters, as JD knows. He was in there with me at Primavera when we first started doing this and went through many changes. Hey, Sanjeev. Sanjeev's here too. Oh, I love it. Um, and so that was over 20 years ago. Jeez. And so I've been in that world, trying to help lead some of that for the last 20 some years as a trainer, coach, advisor. And, some of those projects at first were data warehouse, type projects that I started running into in clients and started recognizing, after they learn what, things like Scrum were and all these practices, that how does it apply to what we're doing? And at first we were all trying to force fit uh, the practices into what they were doing instead of adapting the practices because, at the time everybody was really trying to stick to the script, I guess. And but as that, transpired, it required some changes, which is kind of interesting because we're seeing the same thing with a lot of AI type work today, is really trying to figure out how to adapt the practices. So you're going to see some of that as well. So my I guess my biggest things were software development, agile practices, and now AI. And I try, even though I want to get into the nuts and bolts of the math behind it. I keep trying to pull myself back to the management side of it and the strategy side of it. That's what's helping my clients the most. So trying to stick with them on that. And education, I've had my undergrad in computer science, master's in organizational dynamics, and a doctorate in management. So I've really tried to balance the technical world and people world all at the same time for all these years. Uh, Pretty tough to do, but seem to be okay with it. And so it's a little bit of my background. I am from Philadelphia, so obviously the accent is there, and of course, super excited about my Eagles football team, American football team, winning the Super Bowl. So if you want to talk about that, I could go on about that for a few minutes too. Okay, so the three main areas I try to cover here is just like sort of what is the impact of AI development. There are, two major themes there. One is using things like Gen AI, and the other is creating AI products, not just in the Gen AI space, but what we call traditional AI now. It's funny how fast traditional got into AI, but some of the things like predictive analytics and stuff like that that isn't as fun and sexy that you see in things like ChatGPT, but has been around a lot longer. So we'll take a look at some of that stuff. Some of the challenges that are common across these things that you have to look into and often involve a lot more people in the organization than we're used to. So that requires a lot more collaborative work to be done, including things like legal and getting them involved with everything. And then just, some of the future trends, like what's sort of coming. And by future, like I said, that means tomorrow, by next week, this stuff will be old, I guess, but that's how things move. So it's kind of interesting. So just to kind of set the stage on when we talk about AI, it's a huge area. Um, AI is like a category, but there's so many things underneath that category, and we tend to lump it all into the new things. Like I said, things like ChatGPT, and some of the image generators and all the fun things that we'll have. In fact, I'll show you something at the end here. It's kind of interesting, but there's different types of AI, patterns out there, they call them. And this is a great chart, little diagram, comes from a company, Cognilytica, which just recently got acquired by the PMI, who is doing a pretty good job of keeping up to speed on things in their recent history. So it's kind of nice to see. But if you look at this, there's different categories. Like you have conversation, which is like, chatbots, virtual assistants. Some of these things have been around for a very long time, like Siri, Alexa, those types of things. And now, pretty much anywhere you go as a consumer on a website, oh, do you want some help? And you see a little chat thing going there, and, you start chatting. You have to realize you're probably not chatting with a human, I guess. So that's been around for some time. It's not new. It's getting a lot better, and it's getting a lot more capability. You have recognition systems to interpret things like images, speech, text. Autonomous systems, which are things like autonomous vehicles that operate pretty much semi-independently or independently. Uh, uh, there's less of the independent and more of the semi-independent, if anything, but that's some of the toughest AI to do. It's very data intensive and usually has a lot of risk to it. Hyper personalization, again, something that we've all experienced as consumers. If you've never been on the development of retail or anything like that, but mostly everything has a lot of hyper personalization, meaning that when you go to things like Netflix, Amazon, all your favorite, places to go buy and absorb things, that what you're getting as an experience is completely unique to you. You could have somebody in your family that's on a Netflix site or app, and they're seeing something completely different. They try to do it by asking, like, hey, who's watching and all that stuff. But there's all these things that are making sure that in whatever you see this is good or bad, there are good and bad to everything, but that what you're being presented with is specific to things about you. And maybe it used to be just within the Netflix environment, things you've watched, things that other people have watched that are like you, but now their algorithms can go out everywhere. Like, we've all given them, you know, inadvertently access to everything about us. And so they can go out and find out, like, hey, what were you shopping for on Amazon? Maybe you'd like to see a movie about this. So there, that hyper personalization is there. Then you have patterns and anomalies, which probably a good example of that would be fraud detection, credit card fraud detection. It's like an old thing that has really improved over time. Uh, this was, trying to determine if a credit card charge is something that you actually did, or maybe it's a fraud charge. And in the beginning, when they used to first have these, it was flagging like everything, and then the patterns got better, and the algorithms learned more about you. And then we had mobile devices, which then connected you with a geolocation. So it's like, well, if you're in Philadelphia and your card just was used to buy gasoline in California, that's probably could be a problem, right? So they've gotten better over time, but that's what those are about, trying to find uh, you know, uh, these anomalies and massive data patterns, right? Trying to find out what that looks like, or try to find similarities amongst large data that we couldn't do. So there's a lot of examples of that. Predictive analytics, trying to forecast the future. Again, that's been around for some time, but again, getting better and just more data and widely more available, and algorithms have improved. And obviously, computing power makes that a lot more achievable. And then you have goal-driven systems, sort of like something like Google Maps, trying to get directions and find the optimal route to something. And obviously that works with organizations like UPS, FedEx, things like that, where they have to find optimal routes. So those are kind of patterns that are out there AI. So it's a lot bigger than Gen AI, which you might find mostly in the conversation and human interaction area, right? So kind of interesting. Uh, and then once you understand the different patterns, then you say, well, what do you do with this stuff, right? What are the things you can do? So I just put down here, some of the sort of solution areas that you might be looking at, like prediction, classification, handling language, translations, sentiment analysis, trying to look at, if you have customers and they're talking about you on social media, trying to get a constant pulse for what they're saying, or get alerted to where your company might be having a problem out there. Uh, Sensory things, trying to get data from a lot of different devices, Internet of Things, smart cities, smart traffic, all kinds of interesting things there. Intelligent agents, which is becoming a pretty popular thing now, where first we had agents that can do stuff for you. Now it's like intelligent agents that sort of start to operate semi-independently and can do things for you. Uh, and those are getting more and more, part of some of the things we're all seeing in things like Microsoft Copilot and Chat GPT, or whatever other GPT you might be using. But they're out there. And obviously the big one that everybody's so excited about over the past couple of years is the ability to generate new things, new text, new images, videos, sound, uh, and things that are, models that are learning based on previous documents and stuff you already have. And they've obviously learned on the corpus of the internet, and everything that exists in the internet and beyond that, all the PDFs out there, and the world knowledge, I guess. So that's kind of interesting, and people are doing some stuff with that. And obviously there's some advancements. Just had DeepSeek a couple weeks ago that shocked the world, and did something at a much lower cost than that has been previous done from other companies like OpenAI and uh, Google and all those people. So that's the obviously big one that everybody's excited about, just because it's so fascinating. Um, as far as why why these things become so popular and what, what the drive is. Obviously it's new technology, it's kind of cool, but how do you apply it, right? It's like interesting to sit there by yourself and generate images and, have it, do your homework for you or whatever, write a paper, create blog posts, even though everybody knows you created a blog post with AI because it has all the emojis. I don't know why it gets, maybe probably tell it to stop that. But there's some statistics out here that 75% of global knowledge workers are already using AI at work. 70% say they would delegate as much work as possible to AI to lighten their load. Of course, they probably wouldn't tell their boss that. 82% of leaders believe employees will need training and upskilling to keep up with the growing impact of AI. And then 79% of business leaders um, agree that adopting AI is critical to remaining competitive. So if you're looking for why, companies might be excited about this, um, that might be something, although that's really just saying employees are using it, they want to lighten their load. Uh, Leaders know that they're going to have to upskill their workforce. I'm sure they're not thrilled about that because that costs money. So something has to offset the money. I'll show you another slide about that. And then you need it to be competitive because worrying about whether AI is going to take your job is not the thing you should worry about. Worrying about somebody that has AI skills taking your job is something to worry about. And that's why we try to focus on, making sure people are keeping their education up. So when it comes to businesses and why they might be interested in this wonderful stuff, right? Well, this kind of tells that story. But 457% potential ROI, and I have the sources for this in the presentation here. 56.7 million potential reduction in expenses. This is through a Forrester survey. 35.6 million increase net income. So that'll get you going, and 30% decrease in onboarding time. So this has a lot to do with this one was related to a study of adoption of Copilot, Microsoft Copilot. So but these are staggering numbers from a business perspective. There's many others out there. There's been all kinds of studies about potential and what companies are realizing. So you of course with numbers you can always look at, oh, these people think it's great, and then you can see another study and say, oh, that's great, but here's the real world, and so you see these differing opinions. But if you look at the sort of the full scope of it, it looks to be, and based on experience, it is something that can really advance things, save money, reduce time it takes to do some things. And so anytime you have that increase in profits, increase in income, as soon as people hear that, that's it. I had one statistic that AI use of AI in a company can increase revenues by 6 to 10%. And if you're in a business and you see something that can increase revenues by 10%, I mean, you're going for it in some way, shape, or form. You're not going to ignore it. So it's really trying to translate. Okay, well that's great, but how do you get there, right? That's a lot harder. So the impact that it's having is that it's really reshaping a lot of different sectors. So if you look at all the different sectors, whether it's fintech, ed tech, um, manufacturing, any of these things, it's having an impact everywhere, right? And in some cases, these technologies have already been having an impact for decades. So it's not new to them. What's new to a lot of people is the Gen AI stuff. So, but the other stuff has been around for a long time and, driving efficiencies and innovations. Um, and that's kind of been there. Um, and what's changing a lot now with the computing power, with Gen AI, is that now it's starting to have, for companies that deal with consumers, it's allowing them to have a very different relationship with their consumers and for the consumers to have a different experience with them. And in most cases, pretty positive. Of course, when it goes negative, and somebody has a bad experience, that winds up in, every social media post and newspaper and, media outlet. But that's going to happen, right? Anytime there's an interesting negative story, some AI model hallucinated or somebody got this response, and we all want to see like where it doesn't work, and so you see those things. But it is really changing. It's changing medicine. It's changing medical research. It's helping us discover new drugs much faster, at way less time than we've ever seen. And so that's enough to get things going, right? And as the technology increases and the adoption increases, obviously the costs start coming down, and that seems to be happening faster than it has before, right? So it's definitely on an accelerated path. So again, when the costs lower and it provides that much benefit, people are going to go for it. Some of the challenges when you go to develop solutions are, first, the ethics of it, which people's ethics. I was in some webinar a couple weeks ago talking about some ethical decisions that people make. And I'm like, well, it's kind of funny how the ethics change when the revenues increase. People are all ethical in the beginning, and then they start making tons of money, and then their ethics sometimes tend to slide a little bit. But there are some questions that are pretty serious in terms of, the big thing, which is on the ethical side, is just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. And so when you start looking at things like bias, right? Uh, Historical data in a lot of areas is biased. It reflects what we have all done as humanity over the time that we've been collecting data. And so there is a lot of bias out there in various forms. And that requires a very different approach to correct it before you start feeding data into models that are learning from it. If we were biased as humans, and that's what the history tells us, then that bias, if you just feed it into a model, is going to be there in a AI solution, which is not good. And so there are various techniques for dealing with that, but that has to be discussed openly up front. And so that's one of the things. Privacy is another big thing. We have so much data on everything. Everybody's worried about their privacy, but every time they have an app, or with their iPhone or their mobile device of whatever type you like, I mean, how many times have you hit agree on a license agreement because you want to use an app? I mean, and they redo the agreements and you just keep hitting agree. And and that there's laws and stuff in various countries, but I mean the basic idea is that once you hit agree for most of these things, you've just allowed them to get all kinds of data about you. And we all benefit from that too. So on one hand, we don't want to be casting all our data out there. On the other hand, you want the benefit of the technology. So it's like you're making a trade-off, although one party seems to know what they're going after, the other doesn't know that they're taking that data, but you want the benefits. So there are some things there of privacy, and a lot of that goes back to data again. And then there's accountability to, especially when there's decisions being made by AI, how is it making those decisions, right? To have this transparent accountability to know how, if it decides on a loan, like this person's not going to get a loan or is going to get a loan, how did it come to that decision? And making sure that that's out there and that there's some traceability to that. And obviously in certain areas like fintech and other areas where that becomes, much more important. And so in order to use it responsibly, you have to really be tackling the ethical questions about it, which, if you're a technology person, we tend to get pretty excited about stuff. And when it comes to this, we're like, yeah, yeah, we'll deal with that later. But that's a problem because you really have to deal with it up front. And there are technical limitations. Data quality is a huge issue that has to be dealt with. There's people that have gathered statistics about data quality, but again, when you're using historical data to feed or create a model, uh, that data is usually not in good shape. I mean, I've seen some things just broadly that, 70% of the data that we have historically is a mess and has to be cleaned up. And that sort of makes sense. We've done a pretty good job of collecting it for many years and storing it, but not a good job of cleaning it and prepping it for what might be used for a model. And there's different constraints on algorithms and the computational power required. If you're going full out creating your own models, which most people are not doing, they're using one that's already out there. But the ones that are already out there, until DeepSeek came along, were utilizing massive amounts of energy to do that, to the point where my favorite one was Microsoft investing a huge amount of money in the operation of the nuclear plant 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania here, the one that melted down many decades ago, and trying to bring that back online to fuel their data centers for AI, for Copilot. So kind of interesting that, requires nuclear power plants to have it create your PowerPoint presentation. Uh, and so all that stuff, whether it's on a smaller scale or bigger scale like that, can have an effect on the reliability and effectiveness of something you might be creating. And then there's the regulatory frameworks and the legal frameworks that are out there. They are still being developed. The US had some stuff based on a presidential order that Biden put in place. And then when we just had a change of leadership here, that was all rescinded. So not sure where that's going to sit, but right now we're flying without much regulation at all. Then Europe has some stuff, and so each country is trying, and if they, are trying to get some stuff in place globally. There's a lot of discussions about getting things in place, but even if we got that perfectly, great, and we had a great regulatory framework out there to make sure that people are using it fairly and transparently and responsibly, uh, there's plenty of bad actors out there, as we know, that don't really care what your country put together in terms of regulation. They're going to bypass that, and that could cause a lot of damage. So, so the regulatory stuff is out there, and then you have, of course, highly regulated industries, which have to make sure that their AI solutions go through the right reviews and are transparent and all those things, to make sure that they're safe, they're fair, they're not going to expose the company in a legal sense, which a lot of these things have never made it to production because of that. I've had a couple clients where they spent a lot of money putting a solution together. The technical people got all excited and started creating solutions. And right before they went to deploy it, they had to get a legal review. The legal people came in and said, "Wait, what did you do?" And then they're like, "Yeah, that's not going anywhere." So, and then they shut the whole darn thing down. So, big waste of money. Uh, Maybe involving the legal people from the beginning would have had a different outcome. But when you dance in with something that powerful and it exposes the company legally in regulated areas, that's not going to go to production. So while the technical team may have learned a lot, one of the biggest lessons was, hey, you can have all the great technology in the world, but if it creates an exposure for the company, it's not going out. And that's the end of it. So those are some of the big challenges that we face, and they're not easy because they're not technical, right? They're a lot of these things are, again, ethics and regulations and making sure we're doing things the right way. So a lot of times when people are coming out of a traditional software environment, even if it was an agile practice, it's still very different when you're developing AI. And the main reasons are first that traditional software development is very deterministic. you're creating code, it has rules, it's going through calculations, whatever you're doing, and every time it goes through, it does the same thing. In AI, it's more probabilistic. It is probabilistic. So every time you do something, there's really a different answer. So, if you go, even if you try this with, have a prompt and go to three different AI, GPT models, like uh, uh, OpenAI, ChatGPT, or Claude, or Perplexity, and put the same prompt, you always get different answers. If you come back one day and give it the same prompt, you get a different answer. So it's not going to always be the same. It's based on probabilistic math. So it's always going to be a little different. Uh, then you have data dependencies that are highly unpredictable. The scope is always evolving. So as soon as you start seeing something, it's like, oh, this would be cool if we had that. So you have that coolness factor, but you're discovering along the way. So you see a lot of evolving scope. Um, Everything's about data. Uh, you have to have data. You have to clean the data. It has to be prepped. Again, if you're building your own models, or if you're feeding information like documents into a something like Google Notebook LM, where it's sort of like setting up a retrieval augmented generation, a RAG, and you have to make sure that that stuff you're putting in is good, right? Because it's going to use that, and then it's going to go out to its model. So it's always about data in some form. And with data, you have data changes constantly. Um, Data can drift, models can drift, where it starts to learn and it's learning from what it's seeing. Or you created a model and then it's dealing with the real world and it starts changing because of the real world prompts. Every time we use an AI model, it's learning from what we're telling it or what it's providing and how we respond to that. So it can start to drift. And obviously, the big one that everybody loves to see every once in a while is hallucinations, where it starts responding with things that look real but aren't. Usually you'll see that, and they are getting better with this. And some of the sort of infrastructure things like Microsoft Copilot have a lot of guardrail type stuff in there. But sometimes you'll go and ask it like, hey, put like some historical figure and ask, can you tell me something about this person? And it'll respond with something that looks like, oh, wow, looks like an interesting bio on that person. But the truth is that some of the things in there are completely false. It looks real and it looks valid. And, you could say, well, maybe they did that, but they didn't. And so it's not always right. So it can hallucinate, it can go off track and start just losing it kind of thing. And then there's always the we call it the creepy factor, where some AI starts getting a little too close to humanity, like it starts to get too real. And I think as humans, we have a tolerance for technology where we'll deal with it and we're okay up to a certain point. But when it starts getting too much like a human, it starts getting very strange. I'll give you an example from myself. Um, Copilot, I guess about a month ago, they released this thing on your browser, on the Edge browser, where it's kind of working with you as you're going from web page to web page. And then it starts talking to you like, hey, do you want me to help you look for something? And then you respond to it, and it's having a conversation with you like in real time. There's no delay. So it's really like, wait, there's somebody watching what I'm doing. And then we're like over my shoulder and having a conversation with me about this. Like, to me, that got too creepy. And I just turned it off because I was like, all right, I mean, it's cool, but I don't, that's too much for me. Uh, Other people might find that great, so everybody's got a different tolerance for that, but kind of interesting. When you think about creating solutions, are, just because we can do it, should we do it? Is this something that people will find helpful, or is this crossing the line for now, right? Maybe the line moves later, but for now, there seems to be some kind of line. Uh, Talking about the upskilling, you have a lot of team skills. The composition of teams is going to change. I still think from my experience, that like agile practices and the way we do things, even though people love to say it's dead. I mean, you're not creating AI with a fast moving team-based approach and iterating. So, and getting feedback along the way. So when you break it down to its core elements, again, I always tell people, nobody's using the waterfall to create any AI solution. Like that's not happening. Um, so I think it's just a matter of the skills have to be changed. The composition of people on the team are a little different. And, again, going back to the ethical societal training, data bias is always there. You have hypes, the hype of all this, the fears of it, the always unrealistic expectations. I find people think this is just like turn on a switch and we're going to be 4,000 times more productive. We won't need developers because it'll just start writing all the code. Just saw a study that I got yesterday in the email in my email that about some of the trends that are happening in things like GitHub Copilot and how developers, because now we have all this telemetry, are now just are they using what it's given them, just letting it go out there, or are they using smart reuse? Is it good code quality? And there's some statistics that are showing, yeah, you can be a lot more productive, but you're also not going using good smart code reuse. The engineering skills are not there. You're not really thinking big. So there's going to be that thing where it's okay, this could be a lot better, but it's also we're missing something. And and letting it just, blurt out code because it works and that's it. Could be a little dangerous. So I think, from a coding perspective, if you're looking at using that stuff, it is pretty impressive. I mean, it's for me, I've been in the business for a long time. And I remember days when we didn't have any debuggers at all. We were, printing things out on green bar sheets and going through it line by line. So to me, it's fascinating. I mean, just looking at it from a career perspective, but um, I've always been a little uh suspicious of things like that as well. So who knows? Could be interesting. It's definitely interesting now. So that, again, there's a lot of different tools, platforms, language models, constantly changing week by week, day to day, hour by hour. If you get any kind of good, decent newsletters you're getting about AI, which I recommend you do, you'll see every morning, like you open the email, like, oh my gosh, like what happened? I was sleeping and there's 18,000 new tools and three new language models out there that are supposedly better for this or that. And just trying to keep it all in perspective is pretty tough. And the other thing that's very different is that the operational side of AI is usually more work than the development side. So, as data changes and it starts operating off real world uh, data, it's going to start drifting. And there's going to be a point where it drifts to a point where it has to be retrained. And that all has to be monitored. So there has to be a lot of monitoring in operations. You have to have constant retraining and determining when to do that, and having a human in the loop and making sure if it's something like something responding to customers, that is responding in the right way, and that if it gets to a certain point or the user, the human says, hey, I'd like to talk to a real person, that it switches off. So there's a lot that has to go on. It's cool and it can do a lot, and for the basic things like, hey, can you tell me what my balance is, and I can get that quick in a chat. That's great. That's awesome, man. That's very convenient. Uh, but if it starts getting anything more complex and it just starts guessing or going off on some like, hey, you should try this. That's where you have to kind of take a look at it. So a lot of different things. The things that are the same, the things we've always dealt with that I've seen my entire career. Uh, the first thing is making sure that you actually understand a problem before you try to solve it, right? Like I always tell people, we're so excited about solving problems that we'll do it before we even know what it is, right? What the problem is. We had solutions before we even hear what the problem is. So again, while that's interesting, it also causes a lot of solutions out there that don't really solve a problem and, cause bloated products and a lot of features that didn't need to be there. And then, you find out like, hey, we put 4,000, capabilities in this software package, but really the users only needed 10. And, so you hope that somebody's going to use it at some point, but why would you be hoping that? You shouldn't be building it in the first place. And that's, a change in the industry as well. It's, it used to be from the, 80s, 90s. It was, just spray stuff out there and hope that people use something and you hit the bullseye. But nowadays being a commoditized environment, you have to be really laser focused on solving a problem. And that has really shown itself in the AI world again, because it's so exciting, it's so powerful, and there's so many things we can do, but we're not really focused on the problem first. And that's one of the first steps you always want to take. And once you understand the problem, then the next thing is understanding what outcomes that what would we need to have in order to show that we were able to deliver value, move the needle, right? You can't just say, oh, like one of my clients I talked to about a month ago is like, oh, we already put like three, AI solutions out there. And I'm like, well, what impact did it have on the business? And like, it's just silence. Like, how did you move the needle? Like, did you go back to the business and say, well, now that we had that, our cost for doing this went from this down to this, or, our productivity went up, or, our customer sat went up, something. And I'm like, oh, we never really thought of that. So so it's just putting something out there. That was it. Uh, you really do, just like everything else, always have to have a set of outcomes that you're going for. Um, Maybe that's why things like even though we've been teaching them for many many years, like things like objectives and key results, OKRs, became a little more popular. I think people are realizing, maybe, I don't know, that we do have to align to outcomes and make sure that the efforts that we're putting in, the cost that it costs to do it, is moving the needle on something so you get ROI. Sounds like a common thing you would do, but maybe not so common. And breaking down problems, prioritizing work, still very important. Having quality practices, even with something new and something innovative like AI, Gen AI, we can't use excuses that, oh, well, it's new, it's going to do things like that. We're in a commoditized world, so you don't get that uh, luxury anymore, I guess if you want to call it luxury, where just because you have something new, you can put it out there and it's going to have a lot of problems. In a commoditized world, as we've seen in other industries, when it's commoditized, when you go out with new things, those new things have to be at or preferably above the level of quality, consistency, and reliability that people are used to seeing. If you drop below that, uh, your product usually doesn't make it. So you really do have to have good quality practices, feedback loops, because you do want to get your customers to give you feedback. Um, Anytime you're interacting with people, especially with AI, you want to make sure you're not crossing that creepy line, and getting feedback on what people actually want to do and how they feel about this. Really important. Uh, Going to always need support from leadership and the teams, the people working on this stuff, because things are changing so much and it's not just like, tell me what you want and we'll just do it. You need to have a team that has a very strong desire to experiment and learn. So learning becomes really important there. And, we want to make sure that that happens. There's frameworks out there. These have been out there for some time, but these are things that are out there for model development. So if you're doing anything like that, but you can see that these have evolved over time as well. But it always starts with understanding the business, then understanding your data, prepping your data, modeling the data, evaluating the models, and operationalizing if you're creating your own models. So there are frameworks out there that we can actually use agile practices with. So if you ever use Scrum, we always describe Scrum as something that wraps around whatever process you happen to be using. Whatever you happen to be doing, maybe it's one of these, that it'll wrap around that too. So you can use that. And most of these explain themselves that way. Like, these are things that you would use within your agile practice. And for all of them, you see arrows going all over the place, pretty much in every direction. That's to really indicate that it is not linear, it is not stepwise, it is not waterfall. It is highly iterative and incremental. So that's why, again, that these practices become really important. And we talked about a little bit of trustworthy AI, so I just put that in there for you. But again, bias in the algorithms, making sure that we have transparency and have accountability. As things evolve, the development environments will start to embrace more of that and have it in there. So when you're creating something, it will start to, generate documentation and things like that that you'll need to ensure that. Um, and it'll have the guardrails. Like I've seen that with the Microsoft Copilot environment. They have a lot of guardrail stuff and accountability things and transparency. So they've kind of tried to build it in there because I guess they're hoping, which probably be true, that that'll probably be for the most people, that'll be your first entry because everybody's used to using Office. So if it's sitting there in Word, if it's sitting there in Excel, if it's sitting there in PowerPoint and Outlook, that's where people are going to get entry to it, right? The other stuff using ChatGPT, popular too, but still a lot of people haven't really got into that. But people are always in the word if they see a little icon there, like, oh, what do you want me to do? Do you want help with this? And they're going to see it through there. So they wanted to make sure that they had all those things built in before it started going to the masses too. The technical challenges, again, data privacy, security, and integrating, right? A lot of integration with other systems can be very complex. And so those often have to be planned out. And it's going to be evolving for a long time and until everything starts talking to each other, I guess. And maybe that's when we're all in trouble when all these systems start talking to each other and realize that we're half their problem. And then maybe that's when they do away with us. As far as your job and your evolution in your job, yeah, this is AI has always been put out there as like, oh, it's going to take away all your routine tasks and that'll leave you free to be creative and use your brain for other things. The reality is it seems like it actually took over all the creative things and made us do the mundane things. So I'm not sure if that's where we thought this was going, but it's pretty interesting. And then with the agents and then when you have start automating agents, intelligent agents, it's going to do more and more of that. Maybe to start picking up on your patterns, like, do you want me to summarize your emails every morning? Kind of already does things like that, but it can respond to people. You could literally sit there and be you, I guess. And so that's something you can either be very afraid of, which of course it's new, you're going to be afraid of it, but I would really try to embrace it and try to understand with all the tools out there, and there are way too many, in my opinion, to even try to wrap your head around. But there's a lot of stuff out there, and just try to dive in wherever you can if you haven't already and try to make it a goal that every day you're using AI in some way, shape, or form, right? Anything. Maybe it's like, hey, every week I'm gonna learn, two new tools that are out there and see if I can use them. Pretty much all of them you sign up for free, so that's kind of nice, and you get a little taste of it. And if you like one, maybe you pay a monthly thing for it for a little bit, whatever you want. But just keeps upping your skills. I think that being afraid of it and just ignoring it is not a good idea. It's not going away. It's here, and it's going to be huge, right? I mean, it's bigger than the internet, from what I remember. It just seems much bigger than that. Some of the innovations that are happening, obviously, the quantum computing and just increasing the power of how much and how fast data can be handled. And then the other side of that, so that's more and more expensive. And then on the other side, you have the cheapening of it, uh, based on the deep seek effect, as I call it, like, where it's like, hey, you don't have to spend $5 billion to do this. We did it for 1 million, like that kind of stuff. And people could say whatever they want, but they did it. And so that starts to call into question, and it did hit the stock prices pretty heavy to like companies like Nvidia that hey, you don't need $40,000 Nvidia chips. You can do this. And so kind of interesting. And neural networks will continue to advance, language processing will continue to advance, and that's going to change how we communicate. Obviously, robotics is going to continue to advance and get cheaper. So that's going to happen. And machine learning will keep getting more interesting and be able to do more. So a lot of new things out there, and this is just a short list. So here's a little closing message for you, just to keep you motivated. In a world where artificial intelligence is reshaping our future, the challenges we face are immense, but so are the possibilities. Embrace your curiosity and let it guide you through the complexities of AI development. Each challenge is an opportunity to learn and grow. Remember, your skills can make a difference. So keep pushing forward, keep exploring, and together we can unlock the full potential of AI. Your journey has just begun. Wow,
That
that looks
was
like me saying that. Guess
that
what?
wasn't you, Bob.
That was not me. The tone's a little off, but uh yeah, that wasn't me. I just I use this site HeyGen, and I asked ChatGPT, or I asked it to give me a motivational message for this webinar, and it wrote that. I said I just need like 15, 20 seconds, and it gave me a little blurb, and then I said, all right, just create a video of me saying that. I could have easily taught, astrophysics, I guess, or whatever I can get it to say. But I mean, it is kind of, if you didn't know me and you didn't hear me, that's pretty good. I mean, that's pretty interesting. So it does do some amazing things. It's scary, it's like scary thinking like, man, if I could get that to say anything, like, it's like that could actually save me a lot of time, but it can also be, really bad. So anyway, that's a little taste of all that. So, the messages, there's a lot to think about. There's a lot to learn. I'm telling you, I have experienced this for the last couple of years. And I've poured into this pretty heavy that some days I'll wake up and I'm like, I really think I know this stuff. And then the next day I'm like, I think I'm an idiot. I don't know anything. So there's this just constant up and down uh, with this that sometimes makes people uncomfortable, but I think just try to embrace that and just keep learning and just remember that there's some basic things we always have to do. It's new technology, it's new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking. It has different characteristics, but we still solve problems and we still have to measure our success. And if you just keep that in mind, then things tend to fall into place. It's when you lose sight of that that it can get out of control. So if you want to connect, there's my LinkedIn. You can get that in numerous ways there, I guess. And if you want to talk about it or you have any problem at work, in your company that you're dealing with in terms of strategy or thinking about how you might do this or where to get started. Uh, Always open to talking to people and seeing what you're up to and giving you some advice and then seeing where that leads. So there you go. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts,
Isn't
ideas?
isn't Scarlett Johansson suing or asking for some sort of a break in this deepfake stuff because of what you just showed us?
Well, what happened with Scarlett Johansson was when OpenAI first came out, they had these, the voice
Yeah,
things you could interact with. It was not when they first came out, a little later. Um, and Scarlett Johansson was the voice in that movie. What was the movie? Do you
yeah,
remember?
with Joaquin Phoenix.
Yeah,
Her.
her.
Yep.
And so one of the voices sounded like her.
Mm,
And OpenAI swore that they didn't use her voice to sample it, but it was clear that they did.
yeah,
And she filed suit and then they took it down. So
gotcha.
yeah. So if anybody wants to use my voice, I will tell you right now, I will not sue you. Uh, so, especially if you're going to make millions off my voice, I just ask for a very small slice. That's all. I'm not going to be greedy. Why anybody would use my voice, I have no idea.
It's just so we can hear you say water
Yeah,
ice.
yeah, right. I can do cameos also. If you want me to wish you a happy birthday, or sing the Eagles chant to your kids, I will do that.
Uh,
Good. Any other questions? Was this helpful?
very much
Y-
so. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, thank you, Bob.
Okay.
Actually, as I was listening to you, I got a question on my mind about how exciting it is and how exciting it is for large companies. And my question that I'm wondering, what do you think can smaller companies do in this space? And let me give an example. We are working on a new product right now, which turns documents into tasks in Jira. And then, well, it's done already. It's a pretty simple thing.
Yeah.
But then we have a bold vision to let AI write the code for these tasks. So ideally, you put a document, project requirements into the tool. It creates a list of tasks, and then it writes the code for that. And
Yeah.
my question is that, can small companies do that, or is it the game only for enterprises? What do you think?
No, I think anybody can do this. Obviously when you're going to create a product that can do something like that, I mean, you're going to have to start small and experiment and pick, like what you said, we have a vision to do this, which is good.
Right. Yep.
That's a vision. That doesn't mean we have to finish it next week. We have a vision. So the question is, uh, what are the first steps that we would take on that journey? Right. And like you said, maybe you have something that already generates documents, right? Maybe that's, okay, well, we got from something ideas to documents, and maybe you have requirements. And then it's like, okay, well, how can we start feeding a requirement into um, a generative model that will uh, write code for us? I actually have a client that built something that does that in their industry. It's very industry specific.
Hmm.
And it does that. It goes from their industry regulatory documents to requirements to acceptance criteria to code, and
Wow.
even they've been toying around with test generation, test data generation. So like to test the code. So it is definitely possible, and people have already done it. The question is, is it you're doing that in a specific space?
Right.
uh, where do you take those first steps to get, a slice of that through? Like, don't try to, what do they call the term, boil the ocean? Don't try to boil the ocean. Like, you got to take
Yep.
small steps. Like, what's that first step to start proving that out, right? For one little thing. And I think once you understand one little thing, and then, different models do different things. And, then you have to look at, how are we gonna operationalize this? Are we gonna use a certain model? Is it gonna be somehow embedded in what we do, or asking people, oh, you have to have this? So there's all these the deployment type questions you're gonna have. But I think before you get to that, I think it's just proving out the whole concept. Like, what does this look like from the concept to an idea to steps to can you realize a small portion of that solution and see if it's viable. And while you're doing that, get feedback from your customers or potential customers that are going to, be the ones that might consume this to find out, like, all right, I mean, that's pretty interesting that you can, have it create code, but we would never use that code. Like, if you find that out, then it's like, all right, then what, is maybe this isn't, even though we can do it, our customers may not want us to do it, or maybe they don't see the value in that, or maybe they're like, oh, we already do that in, Copilot, or we do that in, GitHub Copilot, like somewhere they might be doing that, right? And I would look at some of those things that are out there. And if you send me an email, I'll give you a link to the one that I know about that my client has.
Okay.
And they're trying to, you know, they're productizing that for their industry, so it's kind of interesting.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's, figuring out again, what is the problem we're actually trying to solve for who, and what does success look like, and then what's the viability of it, and what are those steps, and take a look at what others have done and how they model it, and where it's been successful or where it flopped. And I think that's always a good place
Right.
to start,
Right. Thank you. Speaking of feedback, if anyone wants to try and give us feedback on the one that we already built, turning documents into Jira tasks, can you drop down any emoji into the chat, and I'll reach out after the webinar. But you know what, Bob? I still have a question. What do you think? Is it a game which will be won by enterprises, or there is space for other companies? Because it feels like, well, we hear news about large companies taking it all, and I'm still wondering, what do you think? What's the take for smaller companies in this space?
Yeah. Well, yeah, like I said, I was just at this. This is one of the questions I had that I went to the Microsoft has this AI tour that they go around. It's like a 1 day thing, but I wanted to hear some of their bigger customers, like that they're, putting uh, Microsoft Copilot in their environments, big global companies, and uh, and it's like just hearing like, okay, what are you guys doing? Because these are the people with big money. They, I'm sure, pay Microsoft more money than I'll make in 6 lifetimes, right? And so these are the big, big players and how they went about it. And they, one of the things that they didn't go full out, they had little pilot teams that ran in for certain things. So they didn't even say, hey, why don't you just go use Microsoft Copilot for everything? They came up with a use case, a small group, and just said, use it just for that. And let's see what happens, right? Like, let's see what the results are. So they take those small steps. So the first thing that I was thinking about with that is, well, look, even though these big companies are going to be, and Microsoft's going to help them, of course, tell their big story, like, hey, we rolled this out to a global organization and we have 400,000 people using Microsoft Copilot in Word every day. Like, okay, that, but they had to go through a lot to get that. That didn't happen overnight. And I'm sure they bought a lot of services. That's why they're, getting pushed out there. So, but what it says to me is, okay, well, if a big company has a small team to start implementing to see what it does, then that means that a small company can also do that, right? So, you can get your company on, Copilot or ChatGPT, or get a license and make sure that, hey, we have a paid license so we can protect our data. We don't have They can't use our prompts for training. Apparently, we can put guardrails in. There's the infrastructure that they're giving you, obviously at a cost, but not horrible. Um, Gives you the power to try things, and so I do think that small companies they're going to get there because they're going to have to. Um, the big companies are going to do it because of those big numbers I put up there. They're going to do that because they want that. And they heard some other company that looks like them. You get one consultancy, like one of the big five, running on a Copilot, Microsoft Copilot or OpenAI, you get them doing that and talking about, how much money they saved or how much money they made or how much faster they can respond to clients, all that stuff. Believe me, if you're the one, the other four are right behind you. They have to be, or they're going to leapfrog you. So, the bigger ones are going to do that. Small companies are going to have to compete on that. Now, what's going to happen is, in my opinion, is the cost will start to come down. So what a big company might be paying now, you're talking about in 3 to 5 years or less, it's going to be a fraction of that. It's not, it's going to, right now we're all paying, it's like text messaging, right? It's like when text messaging first started, everybody was paying per text message, like, 5, 10 cents a text message, like insane. Like you would think today, like that'd be crazy. Who would do that? Well, we all did it, just like we learned how to pay for water too.
Yeah.
But I think, the costs are very high now. They've come down substantially in terms of the consumer side of this. And I think that'll continue to happen because of the competition amongst the big AI players, and they're trying to get, everybody on their platform. So that's going to drive it down. It's commoditized, right? They're trying to make back the money they've already spent, and they've probably already done that. So it'll just get more widespread, right? And in a way, it's pretty good because the big companies that are adopting early are having to deal with all the risk and the adjustments and trying to make it better and improving it. And so the smaller companies, you're going to start feeding off that so that you don't have to deal with that. So you're not going to have to deal with all that cost and all that pain. It'll just be like more streamlined to, hey, we have a problem. We're going to use AI to solve it, and that's going to be it. And we don't have to worry about all the, like, oh, what if they use our prompts and You know, this everybody's we're all going to get over the fear, and then the smaller companies will be able to jump in that. But you
Right.
know, also a lot of AI players are the small companies, right? All the little apps that we're all using for AI are not big companies. These are startups. They're all startups. That's why it's changing every day, is because every day there's 5 new companies that just launched and they're getting huge investment, which, you know, going back to .com was not necessarily the greatest thing, but it did spark a lot of innovation, right? That's how we got pretty much to Agile practices, was through .com. So it does spark innovation, and then it becomes kind of the norm. So I think it'll get there. I think it's, you know, individually people are using it. Company wide, people are a little afraid of it still. And the big players who realize, like, if we don't get on this train, one of our competitors will, and so we better get on this. And so they're doing that. And you know, they're big fintechs, they're big consultancies, banks, right? Like I've heard a lot of these bigger players telling their stories. And sometimes they're a little inflated, but that's pretty normal. But they are doing something, and you know, doing it on a larger scale. So it'll happen. I think it'll happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Very good. Anybody have any experiences, good or bad, with this stuff that
We're using we built this AI search engine for our corporate site and doc site, Bob, and we realized what you were talking about earlier, like we're basing our answers that we're giving to searchers, you know, on our docs, but we've got some old docs out there that, you know, not the greatest. So we're actually using it internally with experts to ask questions, and if it gets a wrong answer, then we go and, you know, find those sources where it's getting that bad intel, and using that to kind of retrain or rebuild our doc so we can retrain it.
Yeah. So that's a good point, what JD just said, because in that case, notice it was like sometimes you put it out into your, you know, your consumer's face, but you know, sometimes a good way to start is internal, just like that. Like, hey, if we start this internal, that wouldn't cause us pain with our customers, right? And we would recognize, like, okay, our, you know, it's cool that it's going to pull from all these docs that we've had for the last 20 years. But then, you know, as you get the answers, like you're saying, you start to see, well, the answers aren't good because the docs aren't good. So
Yep.
basically, the data is old and it needs to be updated. And so maybe that internal training, like this is good for you, Alex. Like if you guys did that internally for your own code and said, how do we go from Jira ticket to code? And let's look at that code. Would we deploy that, or does it need a lot of fixing? Like what happens?
Right.
And you know, so if we do it internally, and then we get it going, which is, you know, what my client did. They used it themselves internally, and only when they felt very confident, they were like, hey, maybe we should show people, like, hey, we have this
Right.
for our in our industry. So that internal use reduces your risk, right?
Okay. And JD, are you having something like in Stack Overflow for Teams, but with the help of AI?
I'm sorry, what was that, Alex?
You know the product Stack Overflow for internal
Oh
use, which
yeah,
call Teams. Is it
yeah.
something like this?
No, we built our own with our own little vector solution internally. Couple of
Right. But
interns did it over the summer.
the
See,
purpose, I mean, the same, to seek answers within
It kind of
documentations.
it's based on our public documentation for our, you know, for the company. And we have, you know, we're always looking to improve the quality and the accuracy of the content that we publish for our customers. But like Bob was saying, it literally, some of that information is 12, 15 years old. So
Mm.
it's kind of like a Stack Overflow, yeah, but it's a, you know, just a public documentation site.
Okay. Okay. I
Yeah.
see.
little steps. I think that's the way to get to anywhere.
Yeah.
You got to take that first step and try
Right.
to reduce the risk, right? Anything you do internally doesn't expose a problem to your customers, right? So that's the thing. It's like you, if you're, you know, if you can't afford to have something go bad on the customer side, on your end user side, right? Where it's like, whoa, that was embarrassing, or, that really did some damage, right? Like plenty of companies can't afford to do that, especially smaller ones, because, smaller companies don't get a lot of leeway when they make an error, right? It's like startups have a very thin margin of error. And so, trying to play it out internally as much as possible and say, and plus you're building your first success case, right? Here's what we were able to do. We were able to cut our development time down. We were able to do this. Now you have a story, not that, oh, we built this and we think it's going to help you. Right. Well, how come it didn't help you then? Like, why didn't you help yourself first? And, I think if you have your own story about how it helped you, and then he's like, hey, you want to share in this fun with us, then you have somebody that might, and plus you've proven it out. So you're not like letting your customers sort of test it for you. Like that's what I think that's always a bad thing these days. It wasn't bad 30 years ago, but today it is. Like you can't have your customers testing things for you. Like, hey, we don't know if this is going to work. Let's see. Give it to a customer.
Right.
Right. Those are what we call the good old days.
Yeah.
I gotta
Any
go,
more
but thank
final
you, Bob,
questions?
and
Yeah.
thank
All right,
you all
JD,
for
good seeing you
putting
again.
this on. You too.
Hey, no problem.
Yeah.
Give me a call sometime. We'll catch
I
up.
will.
All right.
See ya.
So I think it's time to wrap up. We had a
Okay.
great 1
Very
hour
good.
and almost a half.
Oh, there we
And
go. Bonus.
right. So thank you, Bob, for sharing your insights. I'll reach out to you via email after the webinar for that piece of advice, and we'll send the recording to everyone who signed up to learn from it if somebody missed that being online with us.
Yep. Thank you. And thanks, Kat.